So yeah, I joined the police in 1974 and went to work at Lichfield. In 1976 I was based at Armitage, and from there we covered quite a big area: Armitage, Anzacre, Kings Bromley, Fradley, Orrewus. So I knew a little bit about Orrewus from early on in my career. Then I went back to work in Lichfield, and in the late 1970s there'd been a lot of trouble throughout the country with riots, and one of the things that they said was that nobody knew who their policemen were, and so many forces looked to put policemen back in the community. And that's what happened particularly in the south of the county, and 2 or 3 of us were asked if we would like to go and work at certain places, one of those being Orrewus. Now the house at Orrewus had been there for some considerable time, and people, even in my time there, used to talk about Harry Newbon and Bill Stone, who'd lived in the police house many years before. But it hadn't been a police station since, as far as I recall, the late 1960s. So the station was opened back up again, and on the 1st of April 1981, a very appropriate date, I began work at Orrewus. There were 3 of us originally: myself, John Goodwin and Chris Dale. It was obvious to start with that one of the biggest problems in the village was, as I'm sure still happens nowadays, was people's attitude towards and from young people. And one of the first visitors actually to the police office was complaining about youngsters outside the Methodist hall on a Thursday night causing trouble, making noise, making faces at the windows, etc, etc. So I decided that the first thing I needed to do obviously was to see what was going on and see what we could do about it. So the following night, about 6 o'clock, I walked down Main Street, and as I walked past the bus shelter at the end of Post Office Road, I heard that lovely Laurel and Hardy theme. And as I stopped and turned around, the music stopped, and it was a bit like a pass the parcel type thing, and I wondered what was going to happen next. So I carried on walking a few steps, and the whistling started again, and I stopped, turned around, and it stopped again. And there were about, I don't know, about half a dozen, 8 youngsters sat in the bus shelter. So I thought, we need to tackle this head on. So I walked over to the bus shelter and said, come on, move up, I want to sit down. And I'm sure if they can remember it, they probably wondered at that moment what on earth was happening here. And I got talking to them, and like most youngsters, once you get talking to them, you find out that they're not actually the demons that perhaps we think they are. And I told them who I was and what I was here to do, and I wanted to get to know them, and if I got any problems they could come and tell me. But there were also complaints about things that were going outside the village hall and the Methodist hall and other places. And of course, as you might expect, it was none of them that I was talking to, because it never is. But it was apparent that there was a lack of things for them to do, and I know youngsters always say that, but I'm afraid that's how it is. And sometimes you've got to actively engage them rather than just say, well, there are things for you to do, go and find them. So there wasn't a youth club running in the village. I don't even know when the last one had been running, if there ever had been one. So I got into communication with the county council, who ran youth clubs. Spoke to people at the village hall, spoke to a lot of local parents, etc, etc. And there's no doubt that really only because of my position as village policeman I was able to get things rolling, and that it was just the position that helped me do it. I'm sure if a few parents had tried to do it, they probably wouldn't have had the success, and that's not because they couldn't have done it or didn't try. It's just unfortunately sometimes the power of a position can help tremendously. So it was around about October, November time that year we opened the youth club at the village hall. Didn't know what to expect, was hoping we'd get a few youngsters along, and I think on the first night we had about 45 or 50 turned up, and I didn't know what I was going to do with them all. We had a bar football game, we had a table tennis, and we had the infamous dartboard, record player, and a few other items to keep them amused. Over the years, the attendance never really changed much. It was always about 20, 25, 30 a night. Obviously over the years it changed with different people coming and going as they got older and found other things. But it certainly helped me get to know people and get to know people very quickly, and particularly the youngsters, the ones who as always in life, they're going to be the ones who potentially are going to get into trouble just simply by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I had some fantastic times at the youth club. We got involved with a lot of activities county-wide. We had a very successful girls football team that did very well in county competitions, much to the dismay of the lads who never quite managed to achieve the same results. We had pool competitions, all sorts of different things went on. We went days out, Alton Towers, went ice skating once, and I'm still reminded to this day of me skating into the DJ, but we won't talk about that. And I suppose there was the highlight of it all was a sponsored walk we did over a weekend where we tackled the Staffordshire Way in aid of and to raise money in memory of a young lad who died tragically, a young lad called Brett Taylor, who tragically died, and that affected a lot of the youngsters. So that was good. They really got involved in that and got behind that. The youth club carried on all the way through the time I was at Orrewus, and even unfortunately when the police decided that there was no longer a need for a policeman in Orrewus, even though I was living there, I tried to keep the youth club going. But of course now I was working in Burton and I couldn't be there in the same way, and it just got more difficult for me to actually run it, administer it. It was passed over to the village or the youth club committee, and it carried on for a while, but unfortunately through funding and other issues it eventually closed. So yeah, I'd get involved in these sort of events, you know, that were going on at the cricket club and the CB club, and of course the other big event that used to happen was Orrewus Show, and I would be there in my capacity as the local policeman. Massive event, used to draw in people from miles and miles and miles. Unfortunately it suffered, like many of these events, with the weather, and I remember a couple of years of torrential rain and sheltering in the beer tent simply to keep dry, nothing else. But unfortunately the beer tent was also its problem, and they had the same thing at the Bower for a number of years, and eventually stopped with the beer tent. We did have, I seem to remember one year we had a bit of a problem in the beer tent that got a little bit out of hand, but generally, you know, they were fantastic days out with all the sort of rural events going on and rural attractions that people used to and still do enjoy, and I know the Orrewus Show still goes on, and long may it live, because they're a big part of village life, aren't they? That started, as I said, in 1981, and in my own mind I was quite happy to stop there for the rest of my service. I felt like I'd fallen on my feet, and it was probably the best job I'd ever have. It was doing policing as I wanted to do it. But like all things in life, things change, and unfortunately the police force has a habit of reinventing itself. And so in 1990 they decided that they no longer needed a policeman in Orrewus, and unfortunately I was transferred to Burton. Didn't want to go, but in a job like that you don't have a lot of choice, and you're just told to go where you have to go. It was a sad day, very sad day for me. Probably the worst day in all my service is the day I actually finished. But I got some wonderful memories of the time there, and it took me in many different directions. For example, when I first went to work at Orrewus, I'd never ridden a motorbike, and they said that our transport would be motorbikes to start with, and indeed they were for about 3 years, and it was probably the very last type of heartbeat policing you'd ever see, and you'll never see again. And so they asked me if I wanted to go and work there, and I said yes, and they said, do you ride a motorbike? And I said no, I've never been on one, and they said we'll send you on a course. So in February 1981 they sent me to Stafford on a motorcycle course, 3-week course, never having ridden a motorbike in my life. And on the Thursday, after a few days of classroom work and actually getting used to stopping and starting a motorbike, the instructor said, right, we're going out this afternoon after dinner. So we rode out to police headquarters at about 1:30 on a Thursday afternoon. So left towards Cannock, and as we did so it started to snow. So my first motorcycle experience of riding on the road, after about 3 days of actually getting on a motorbike and travelling at no more than 10 miles an hour, was in snow. But it led me in many different directions with motorcycling, and a love that's stayed with me today. So I've got a lot to be grateful for the time at Orihuis. So for the first 3 years, the transport was a motorbike, and of course you're a bit sort of in the lap of the gods with the weather. And bear in mind, the motorcycle gear that they gave us, well, they gave us a helmet, and they gave me a Belstaff oversuit. So underneath which I still wore my normal uniform, and that was it. So it was quite interesting on a January or February evening when I'm working till 2 o'clock in the morning, and you're riding round Orihuis, Kings Bromley and Fradley in the freezing cold, and there's many a time I've got back home and got off the bike to find that the seat, which was black vinyl, is white except with a certain imprint of a certain part of my body. That's the only bit that hasn't frozen over on the bike. There was one period when, I think that was the first winter, where we had quite a heavy snowfall, and because the roads didn't go and get gritted in the villages at all, Wellfield Road in particular, the ice froze, traffic drove over it, it froze again. So for 3 weeks it was impossible to get out of the village on the bike. So I walked everywhere, and I walked to Fradley. I almost walked to Kings Bromley but never quite made it. But I did manage to get to Fradley Junction, and that was quite interesting because I decided I needed to go up to Fradley Junction because I hadn't been there for a while. So I walked out the village and started walking up the main road towards Orgreave. And suddenly I was aware of this noise behind me, and I turned round and it was the snowplough. And he stopped, and obviously he was quite surprised to see this policeman in the middle of nowhere. So he asked me if I was alright, and I said yes, I'm fine. He said, where are you going? I said, Fradley Junction. He said, do you want a lift? I said, yeah, go on then. I jumped into this snowplough, and as we're going up he says, just move that lever down there, will you? So I ended up actually helping the local authority with their snowploughing operations. Probably something now that would be completely impossible because of health and safety regulations, but it got me a lift to Fradley Junction if nothing else. I also remember that same winter walking around the village 1:30 in the morning, and at the time I had a bit of a tash, and it was so cold it went to -17, I think was the coldest it actually went that winter. And I remember walking past Leavesley's garage, and I blinked, and I must have had some eye drops or just some tears in my eye or something, and for a moment my eyes froze together and I had to put my hands on them to open my eyes again. It was a pretty cold winter, that was. I remember we in the police house we didn't have central heating either, we only had coal fires, and I remember many a morning waking up to see ice on the inside of the windows in the bedroom. And you think back, that was only in the 1980s, you know, we were still a little bit in the dark ages in some ways, weren't we? But yeah, some happy times in Orihuis, lots of memories. You had to get to know everybody. You got to know families, you got to know individuals. I got to know things that families didn't even know about their own families. But there was some lovely characters and people, as always in village life, there's always some lovely characters. The Tree Cafe that used to be right next door to us, that's now the British Legion, that was a 24-hour-a-day operation. And that was the scene of one interesting little episode one night when I was fast asleep about 2 o'clock in the morning, and there's a noise outside and someone's banging on the front door. So I went to the bedroom window and opened it, and there's a man standing on the front of the house looking up at the window, and in a very broad Scottish accent shouts, "Is your wife in?" Which is an unusual request at 2 o'clock in the morning to a policeman. So I asked him why, and he said, "I don't want to speak to you, I want to speak to your wife." So I said, "Look, you can speak to me, what do you want to know? What's the matter?" And he said, are you going to speak to me, or are you going to get your wife to speak to me? And I said, look, what is the problem? And he said, you'd speak to me if I'd stabbed someone, wouldn't you? And at that ran off. So I thought, now, do I go back to bed and just pretend it's some idiot? But I didn't recognise him, it wasn't somebody I knew. And what if he has stabbed somebody? So I rang Lichfield Police Station, told them what had happened, and funnily enough they'd had 1 or 2 phone calls from people down Wellfield Road saying the same sort of thing. So I grabbed my police radio and my police truncheon and set off walking down Wellfield Road. There was 1 or 2 house lights on, and after a short while a police car from Lichfield arrived, so I jumped in and we drove round to see if we could see this person, and there was no sign of anything. When we drove past the Tree Cafe, we noticed that the lights were on because it was a 24-hour day operation at that time. And suddenly, sitting at one of the tables talking to someone who I presume was a lorry driver, was this man. So I said to the policeman, just pull on the car park there, quick. So I walked in, and bear in mind I was in civilian clothing, so he didn't know who I was. So I walked up, sat down at the table, and I said, do you recognise me? And he said no, and it was quite apparent as soon as I spoke to him that he was very heavy in drink. And I said, you just banged on my house, waking people up, you've been waking people up down the street, what's going on? Yes, he said, I'm very sorry about that, I'm very sorry, he said, but I need to know what's happened in Crossroads. And that must have been one of the most unusual things that anybody had ever said to me throughout my police career, before or after. And I said, what do you mean you want to know what's happened on Crossroads? And he said, I needed to speak to someone to find out what had happened, because I'm travelling down to ATV Studios and I've got a script and it's up to date, but to keep it right up to date I need to know what happened in tonight's episode, but I missed it because I was hitchhiking and nobody will tell me what's happened. At first I didn't believe him, and you wouldn't, would you? But when he opened his suitcase and actually pulled out the script and I read it, I realised that probably he was telling the truth. So unfortunately I hadn't watched Crossroads, so I couldn't help him, so I advised him not to go waking people up at 2 o'clock, and I'm sure he'd find out one way or another, and we left him to it. You never knew what you were going to come across, and bear in mind, for most of the time I was working, I was on my own, and there was again late one evening, it was about 1 o'clock in the morning, I decided to have a last walk around the village. And at the time, Leavesley's garage was still open in the guise that he had at that time, selling vehicles and all sorts of things. And they'd had 1 or 2 problems with bits being pinched off vehicles, so it was always something I was conscious of. So as I walk onto the car park, I'm suddenly aware of this figure scurrying from the canopy under the main showroom, almost bent double, running towards a line of vehicles that were parked near the road. It's very odd at 1 o'clock in the morning. So I just stood there and I took my policeman's hat off and just stood and watched. And after a few seconds, ran back again. And then went back again to the line of vehicles. So I walked up nice and slowly, and as I got near, there was this young chap on his hands and knees with a wheel brace undoing the wheels on this car. I stood there, and probably one of the most stupidest things I ever said, I looked at him and I said, "What are you doing?" And he replied in probably one of the most stupid replies to come back at a stupid answer, and said, "I'm just borrowing this wheel." And I said, "Oh right, and I noticed you're borrowing all the other wheels as well, because none of those have got wheel nuts on." And at that he sort of said it's a fair cop, as everybody does, and I arrested him and he was carted off to Lichfield. It transpired that he was from Tamworth, quite a well-off young man, but he brought this car and he wanted to do it up, but when they actually looked at it, about 90% of the bits he'd done it up with had been stolen off other people's cars. So unfortunately his crime spree came to an end. There were lots of characters throughout the villages who used to keep me amused for many a happy hour one way or another. And there was a lovely old couple that lived at Fradley, and very often he would bring me things, but he used to bring them to me at very unusual hours of the day and in an unusual way. And he caught me twice very early on a Sunday morning. The first time he knocked me up because he found a cushion in a hedgerow that had probably been there for about 3 weeks anyway, but he thought somebody had lost it and they needed to find it. And then the following week he came to me with almost a dead pigeon in his hand that he found in the middle of the road, and he walked all the way from Fradley to bring it to me. So it was nice that he thought I could help, but I don't really know what he expected to be do with a half-dead pigeon, you know. So youngsters were often the cause of much of my work in a very pleasant way, but they also caused some amusement as well. There used to be a quarry at Kings Bromley, and they're like magnets to young people. You know, they're great places to ride your bikes and go swimming and break the windows on the diggers and all sorts of things. So the quarries that we had at Orrewas and at Kings Bromley were places I used to have to visit. And there were back ways in that you could get in even though the places were supposed to be secure, the places I knew. And because I was on the motorbike in the early years, I was able to gain a lot of access to these places, and it was a bit like off-road riding. But there was one Saturday, I had a phone call that there was some kids had been seen climbing over the wall into the quarry at Kings Bromley. So I went up, disturbed them doing whatever they were doing, and they ran off across the fields towards Yoxall. So I set off in hot pursuit on my 250 CZ motorcycle, but unfortunately didn't spot the overgrown ditch that was looming up at me. For a moment I thought about trying to recreate the scene from The Great Escape, but unfortunately I didn't have the wherewithal to actually jump over the ditch, and ended up with the front wheels splat down in the ditch, and me lying in the mud at the side of the bike. I think I may have shouted out one or two expletives because all the kids suddenly stopped and given the jib actually came back to see if I was alright, which was very good of them. They hadn't done anything, they were just being kids. So they helped me get the bike out of the ditch, and I rode it back home with the handlebars like this until we could get it sorted. But there were lots of incidents with the young people that always, to this day, will always amuse me. Halloween was a big problem. It was in the early 80s, the American tradition of eggs and flour had crept in, and like many places, the youngsters of Orrewas had taken it to their hearts and wanted to do their bit for the egg trade. Local shops and suppliers were quite happy to leave out eggs or sell eggs to anybody that wanted them, but unfortunately the next day were the first to ring up when they'd actually been splattered themselves and were now trying to hose off egg and flour. And it was a bit of a problem, and in hindsight it was funny, but at the time for the people who'd been splattered with egg, I'm sure it wasn't. And so the following year I decided I needed to try and prevent it from happening. So I was walking along Main Street, and there's this group of young lads walking towards me, and it was obvious they were up to something, you can just tell. "Alright lads, alright Ben, what are you up to?" "Nothing Ben, no, just walking round, you know." "You're not come to throw eggs and flour then?" "No Ben, no. You haven't got any on you, have you?" "No Ben, no, we haven't had any." "You don't mind if I check, do you?" "No, of course not. Come here then." So I gave him a quick pat down, and as I got to the trouser pocket I felt something give, and the look on his face was as much to say, "Oh no, what's just happened?" There must have been probably half a dozen eggs in his pocket, and so I patted him again just to make sure that he hadn't got anything, and sent him on his way saying, "Yeah, that's okay then, off you go." And I imagine the smell of egg pouring down his leg was enough to make him get home quick and explain why he was now covered in scrambled eggs.